de boas-vindas inicial às pessoas que estão ali assistindo, é isso? Tá. A tua ideia é a gente fazer uma fala...
Estamos online. Esperando as pessoas chegarem. Olá, boa noite para quem está acompanhando mais um DigiLabour Conversations, hoje aqui com a professora Veena Dubal, da Universidade da Califórnia, em uma organização combo dos programas de mestrado e doutorado em Comunicação, em Direito, e do mestrado profissional em Direito da Empresa e dos Negócios da Unisinos. E a Universidade do Vale do Rio dos Sinos se mobilizando inteiramente para receber uma importante figura da regulação do direito do trabalho, da regulação do trabalho em plataformas digitais, a professora Veena Dubal. Antes da professora Veena falar para a gente sobre a ambivalência da Uber, a gente tem muito a falar também sobre princípios éticos na pesquisa sobre trabalho em plataformas, eu queria passar para a coordenadora do programa de pós-graduação em comunicação, Ana Paula da Rosa, que vai dar as suas boas-vindas à professora Veena Dubal. Oi, Ana.
Oi, Rafa. Olá a todos. Professora Veena, seja muito bem-vinda ao Unisinos e aqui conosco nesse espaço de troca, de interação tão importante. Agradeço em especial a participação de todos nesse evento que reúne o PPG em Ciências da Comunicação, o PPG em Direito e também o mestrado profissional em Direito da Empresa e de Negócios, que é um momento muito importante de interação, de trocas de conhecimento, de interface de áreas entre o direito, a comunicação, principalmente com esse assunto que tanto nos mexe, ainda mais em tempos de pandemia, né? Quando falamos sobre as plataformas digitais e a questão do Uber, né? Então, essa matriz comunicacional que surge aí, mudando tudo, inclusive as relações de trabalho. Então, agradeço especialmente a professora Veena por essas trocas, por esse momento conosco, e que seja uma noite muito especial.
Muito obrigado, professora Ana Paula. Agora passamos para o professor Guilherme Wunsch, representando o mestrado profissional em Direito da Empresa e dos Negócios. Boa noite, Guilherme.
Boa noite, professor Rafael. Boa noite, professora Ana Paula. Welcome, Veena. Boa noite a cada um e a cada uma que está assistindo esse painel do DigiLabour, que é, na verdade, uma grande ideia, né, efetuada pelo professor Rafael. A Unisinos é referência com o professor Rafael nas pesquisas que envolvam questões de economia do compartilhamento, gig economy, uberização do trabalho, e esse é o tema do momento, especialmente também para o direito, né, e para o direito do trabalho. Afinal de contas, hoje nós começamos a discutir muito essas questões de vínculo de emprego ou não, de trabalhadores por aplicativos, as formas uberizadas das relações de trabalho, os controles por algoritmos e qual é a influência que isso vai ter num futuro muito próximo na nossa legislação. As relações de trabalho, elas estão se modificando, isto não há dúvida nenhuma. E a nossa legislação, ela tem ficado para trás nessa evolução dos fatos sociais, né? E, na verdade, a gente precisa compreender, né, como que nós vamos tutelar direitos destas pessoas que hoje não têm mais esse vínculo formal de emprego, sem que isso signifique uma precarização dessas relações de trabalho, mas também atentos a essas novas formas, né, da economia de compartilhamento que se colocam na sociedade. É um prazer estar aqui dividindo essa abertura com todos vocês. Espero que tenhamos todos um ótimo evento, porque certamente sairemos daqui com muito mais perguntas do que respostas.
Beleza? Muito obrigado, Ana Paula, muito obrigado, Guilherme. Agora eu vou pedir, por favor, para vocês desligarem suas câmeras para conversarmos com a protagonista da noite. Good evening, Professor Veena Dubal. Bom, hoje vamos conversar com a professora Veena. O título da apresentação dela é Ambivalence, Employee Status, Worker Perspective and Regulation in the Gig Economy. É uma parte do próximo livro da professora Veena Dubal, que vai falar, então, sobre regulação do trabalho. Good evening and welcome to Brazil virtually. And very good to have you.
Exciting in person.
E um detalhe, a professora Veena Dubal participou do documentário Gig, a uberização do trabalho, dirigido pelo nosso grande caju, Carlos Juliano Barros. You can share your screen, your presentation, and welcome to Brazil.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this wonderful invitation. I hope now that I'm more in conversation with Brazilian scholars that I will get an invitation to come in person once this horrible pandemic is over with. I'm grateful for the comments and look forward to the Q&A. So, in the US, as elsewhere in the world, a growing number of the US workforce is now considered freelance. That is temp workers, contractees, lessees, consultants, franchisers, workers basically legally considered independent contractors and not employees. And as we move deeper into this freelance economy, particularly in the context of this global pandemic, concerns about worker protection and corporate liability have focused on the distinction between these two categories, independent contractor and employee. And this fixation, of course, makes sense, because when we look at the contemporary regime of employment and labor laws in the United States, this is what we see. Workers who are employees have the theoretical right to be protected from work discrimination, from poverty wages, from unlawful termination. They have the right to collectively bargain, etc. And independent contractors, of course, don't. Understandably, business representatives over the last 30 years or so have concentrated on growing the independent contractor category, thereby lowering financial and legal risks, while worker representatives have advocated narrowing the independent contractor category, ensuring that more US workers are protected by the web of employment and labor rights. And unlike some Western European countries, in the US, almost all of our safety net is funneled through employment. This issue of the difference between employee and independent contractor status has recently become central in debates on the future of work and what we now call the labor platform or gig economy. That is work created through and by companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Instacart. Prior to the advent of these countries about a decade ago, I was studying and writing on the San Francisco taxi industry. And among other things, I was looking at how worker classification took on social and cultural meanings for many drivers. I showed how these meanings had produced a divisive politics amongst driver groups. Since then, for the past 4 years, I've been engaged in theory generating ethnographic work amongst Uber driver groups in California who have been fighting for better working conditions. So the ethnographic research that I've done includes hundreds of hours of participant observation and action at drivers' meetings, protests, in meetings with regulators, on group phone calls and texts, in government hearings, and on one-on-one conversations. With some of the drivers who have gotten to know over a period of time, my ethnography continued into social spaces, and all workers in the drivers groups that I have been hanging out in were Uber or Lyft drivers, although many worked for other gig platforms as well. This research has given me insight into the complex and unpredictable links into law, work, and everyday life. Rather than claim generalizability or static sociological ascription, my multifarious findings problematize overbroad claims to knowledge about workers. Alongside UC Berkeley political scientist Ruth Collier, I also developed a survey instrument and conducted a survey of over 200 drivers in San Francisco, mostly with the purpose of getting a broader descriptive sense of the worker population beyond the drivers who are doing the organizing work. Last year, the drivers groups in which I've been a participant rallied around AB 5, which was this internationally heralded law, which you've likely heard about in the media and passed by the California legislature, signed into law by Governor Newsom just a few months ago. So AB 5 codified a decision that the California Supreme Court decided in April 2018 called Dynamics. And Dynamics changed the test for how to determine who is an employee in California. So instead of a version of the common law control test, California decision makers will use an enforcement-oriented test called the ABC test to determine whether or not workers are eligible for benefits under the California Labor Code and Unemployment Insurance Code. So to be frank, I was surprised by the gusto with which drivers and driver groups in California embraced AB 5 and employee status more broadly, and by the lack of divisive discussion and debate, both in public and in private, on whether or not to support this law. Why was I surprised about this near unanimous embrace of AB 5 by Uber drivers? Well, because existing research, including my own, suggests that the majority of Uber drivers actually have a preference for independent contractor status. And with this in mind, I had a series of questions that I wanted to ask. In examining my data, including the survey, years of field notes, and qualitative interviews, I wanted to know these three things. How can we explain the discrepancy between Uber drivers' stated preference for independent contractor status and their advocacy for employee status? How do Uber drivers make sense of employee status in relationship to their lives and visions for the future of their work? And how might understanding these perspectives impact how regulators approach worker status in the tech-enabled gig economy? To date, you might know, the most influential scholarship on Uber driver preference is in an article written by eminent economists Jonathan Hall and the late Alan Krueger. In a working paper made available in 2015 and later published in 2017, Hall and Krueger concluded, based on survey research paid for by Uber, that roughly 79% of US Uber drivers preferred independent contractor status. This data has been decried in a variety of regulatory contexts, or has been used in a variety of regulatory contexts to deter employment regulations, both on the state and federal level. I myself have heard regulators cite to the statistic no less than 10 to a dozen times. The specific question that Hall and Krueger asked on this issue was as follows. Which of the following would you prefer regarding your driving with Uber? Being classified as an employee of Uber, so you could be eligible for a minimum wage, healthcare, and other benefits, but you would not have the flexibility to set your own schedule, or being classified as an independent contractor for Uber, so you would have the flexibility to set your own schedule, but you're not eligible for the minimum wage, healthcare, and other benefits. So the question, you'll note, does not reflect best survey practices because it's double-barreled, forcing respondents to answer two questions at once when their opinions about the two might diverge. Drawing on a critique of two ILO scholars, I also argue that this question obfuscates the law and does the cultural work of creating a legal misperception among survey respondents. Although many employees in the US have an inflexible schedule, employee status is not fundamentally incompatible with scheduling flexibility, as the question appears to claim. So in developing my own survey instrument administered to San Francisco Uber drivers between February and August of 2016, I avoided this double-barreled problem in Hall and Krueger's question. Respondents were asked in binary terms whether they preferred to be an employee or an independent contractor, and they weren't given any information as to what those terms meant. Nevertheless, the findings from this study were similar to those in the Hall and Krueger study. Most drivers preferred the independent contractor classification. This was true for immigrant drivers, it was true for non-immigrant drivers, for women, and for men. It was also true regardless of whether subjects reported that they were engaging in Uber driving as their primary work, as their supplemental work, or as their only work. So if regulators take the position that driver preference matters, that the law should to some extent reflect the desires and perspectives of those that it is intended to serve, then the survey data seems to indicate that labor platform companies like Uber and Lyft should be allowed to continue to treat their workers like independent contractors, and that employment and labor laws should accommodate these business models. And in several states in the US, it already has. And yet, drivers and drivers groups rallied around AB 5, which raises the question that drives this article, which is why? So after coding and analyzing years of field notes and interview transcriptions for perspectives on employee status, I realized that my ethnographic research project troubled both the survey numbers and the practice of determining complicated preferences through an efficient survey medium. Based on driver narratives drawn from interviews and ethnographic data, I argue that the survey findings capture not attitudinal realities or desires, but in many cases, driver perceptions rooted in fear. So in the context of their relative powerlessness and economic reliance on Uber, employee status was subjectively constructed through a duality. It was both a desirable way to fight back against the company and a status that came with its own uncertainty, including most critically the potential loss of scheduling flexibility. Worker narratives overwhelmingly suggested that drivers had an ambivalent relationship to the employee identity. So in making sense of these legal categories, which frankly have been perplexing even for law professors and judges to parse, Uber drivers said that they unequivocally needed and wanted the protections and benefits that employee status offered. But many were afraid of what a company like Uber would do if they embraced their role as employer. Drivers, in fact, had a really strong sense of the structural and instrumental power of Uber. Their ambivalence towards employee status was fueled by what a terrible employer Uber could be, how Uber would never agree to an employment model, and anxieties that the company would take away their flexibility, not because employee status necessitates a shift schedule, but simply because they could. Nina's perspectives on employee status embodied all of these concerns. A 50-year-old immigrant to the US from Venezuela, Nina began driving for Uber in March 2015. She had previously owned a company with her ex-husband, and after the divorce, she was out of work and without an income. She couldn't hold a steady job because of a medical need to take frequent and unpredictable rest breaks. Nina was involved in a driver-led organization when I met her, and she had officially objected to a proposed settlement in a class action against Uber. She told me that she didn't want settlement money from Uber. She wanted to be an employee. But every now and again, Nina would divulge her fears about employee classification that she was fighting for. In one conversation, for example, she told me, "Of course I want to be an employee, but on the other hand, I think, how would I be treated by Travis Kalanick as him being my employer? He would have a whip on us. What is he going to do to me as an employee? I know he's capable of many things. This man is an awful man, awful to the point that I think he's a sociopath. And to have so many people feeding families in the hands of a sociopath is bad. Uber is so ruthless to these software engineers. Imagine what they would do to us drivers." So on the one hand, all of Nina's organizing efforts had been oriented toward achieving employee status for herself and her colleagues. And on the other, she was plagued by concerns about what working conditions she would have to endure if Uber did become her employer. She already felt exploited by Uber and disrespected by company executives. But without access to company managers, a human relations department, or even accountable regulators, Nina funneled her fury to Uber's legal Achilles heel, how they classified their drivers. Her quest for employee status was fueled both by a desire for employee benefits and by a need to resist her working conditions. Like other drivers in my ethnography, Nina also frequently alluded to the company's structural power, the amount of venture capital money behind gig companies, and the company's influential political connections. For example, my interlocutors regularly sent emails and texts with links to articles discussing investments in Uber or comments by prominent politicians supporting the company for its innovation and job creation. For the senders, these messages were evidence that the company was engaged in unscrupulous graft. They are lining lawmakers' pockets, was a sentiment I heard often from Nina and others. Many believed that the company was actually involved in illegal bribes, but most were alluding to the instrumental power of the company and their deliberate and successful political engagement. The gig companies, they believed, had so much power in the regulatory arena that no matter what, the companies could not be forced to recognize their drivers as employees. For example, Rusty, a Filipino-American immigrant driver, felt there was no way Uber would give him basic employee benefits, no matter what the law and regulators said. Like many migrant drivers in California, Rusty drove from his home in Orange County to San Francisco, roughly 5 to 6 hours away, because the rates were higher than in Southern California. In the context of how much he could benefit from employee benefits, he described his migrant work life to me. For most of the day, I stay in my car, living in my car. I'll have a curtain that I use to sleep. And then there are days when I would be able to get a bath, but there are times when I'm not going to be able to take a bath for 2 or 3 days. Then you sleep in your car, and as soon as you get up, then you start driving. It's really terrible, and I'm far from my family. Rusty wanted the benefits associated with employment, but he chose independent contractor status on our survey. In one of my interviews with him, he clarified that his preference was based on what he thought was most realistic. Over the phone, after returning home to the OC, he further explained his thoughts on employment. And here's the slide that we have in front of us. It will be great if they make us employees, but I don't think Uber will. They're very smart and they're very shrewd and they're very greedy. They're not going to go for it because they make money out of this kind of system that they have right now, where I have to sleep in my car. Why would they change? The law bends for them. Rusty's assessment and his reasoning for stating a preference for independent contractor status were well informed, but they did not reflect a rejection of employment benefits, only a realistic assessment of the company's power. Why fight for this, he said to me. We will never win. Rather than being clear-cut, Nina and Rusty's perspectives on employee status are fueled by an ambivalence generated from fears that the company can act with impunity. Unlike judges or lawyers applying a legal test, drivers took into account the external influences that might impact their lives beyond the obvious benefits of the status. In addition to their feelings of powerlessness in relationship to Uber, the ambivalence that a majority of drivers harbored toward employee status also stemmed from the necessity of scheduling flexibility in their lives. Whether they led transnational lives, endured disabilities that made a shift schedule impossible, or were responsible to and for young children, flexibility for work was not just a desire, it was a requirement. Contextualizing the need for scheduling flexibility and the ways in which it is conflated in driver narratives with the independent contractor classification also helps to explain and undermine the survey data. For example, Paul, a white 25-year-old internal migrant from Pikeville, a poor mining town in Kentucky, had indicated in a survey that he didn't want to be an employee of Uber. When over tea in a cafe in San Francisco asked him again why, he answered, well, maybe not me personally, because eventually I would like to move to another job, but it would be nice to have paid time off. At the same rate, Uber's a horrible company. If they did have us as employees, they might be a lot more strict in terms of customer feedback. Maybe if a customer gave really bad feedback, they might fire us. Paul's answer is much more complicated, again, than represented in the survey. On the one hand, Paul wants the protections associated with employee status. Specifically, he wants paid time off. Our conversation troubled popular assumptions of what workers mean when they say they want independent contractor status because of the flexibility. Paul didn't mean he wanted the privilege to work whenever he felt like it. He meant that he wanted to work whenever he could. Suffering from a mental illness that presents sporadically, Paul was, on unpredictable days, incapable of working. He wanted income protection during those times. That, he noted, would be one positive aspect of being an employee. But like Nina and Rusty, he was afraid that if Uber were his employer, he would be even more at the whim and whimsy of the company, who might fire him based on a single customer's feedback. Another driver, Ashraf, echoed the sentiments of so many other drivers when I asked them why they preferred the independent contractor classification. Flexibility, nothing else. If I get someone to hire me for flexibility, I will work for them. Ashraf was a Sudanese-American refugee who came to the US in 1999 and had 3 small children. His wife, a healthcare worker, had a shift schedule and health insurance. Soon after I got to know him, he had had a kidney transplant. And when I visited him in the hospital, he emphasized to me how much he needed flexibility in his work. With 3 children and living in one of the most expensive areas in the world, he had to start working again as soon as possible. I told him, you know, if you were an employee for Uber, they would have to cover your gas and your car expenses. Okay, then it's okay with me. Then it's okay, he said. I have been an employee, but I need the flexibility. For now, my situation is, he trailed off in exhaustion and muttered, I need the flexibility. Ashraf needed to rest, and I didn't want to belabor the point or make him think about how he would need to start driving again, perhaps sooner than he was physically ready. But I wanted to tell him, as I had so many others, that in spite of what gig companies say, employee status did not mandate a shift schedule. And conversely, schedule discipline did not necessarily lead to the economic security of regulated work. Historically, the test for employee status has focused on how much control a hiring entity exerts over a putative employee. But the 8 to 10 hour shift in America is a relic of factory work and the result not of employer control, but of massive labor-driven reform movements that sought to exert worker control over the rhythm of work. If courts conceptualize time discipline in the service economy, not by the non-existence of a shift schedule, but by how long one has to work to eke out a living, then even under the control test, the supposed flexibility of gig work weighs in favor of employee status. Because gig companies control how much workers earn per fare or delivery, which fares and deliveries that drivers receive, how many fares and deliveries the drivers receive, and how drivers conduct themselves in the context of the fare or delivery, gig workers must work long, unpredictable hours to meet their needs and are subject to all kinds of algorithmic control while at work. As one astute driver told me, what flexibility? I sleep in my car, I eat in my car, I work in my car. That is not freedom. So what implications do these narratives of driver ambivalence have for gig worker regulation? While companies have tried to frame the debate about safety net protections for platform workers around whether or not workers want employee status, I've come to realize that this is fundamentally the wrong question for regulators to consider, both because of the misconceptions that people have about what it entails and because of the ability of businesses to shape how workers think about these categories. For example, in the wake of AB5, gig companies have capitalized off the needs of drivers who cannot work a rigid shift schedule to both misinform drivers of the law's requirements and to mobilize fear against employee status. You'll see this is some of the propaganda that they are sending to drivers. A better inquiry for regulators then is what kinds of safety net protections do today's labor platform workers need? While in the AB5 context, gig companies proposed a bill that would exchange typical employee benefits with something that they said was good for 21st century technology-driven work, their proposals, perhaps unsurprisingly, did not match the basic economic needs of the drivers in my research. So in the negotiations before AB5 was passed, Uber and Lyft kept going to the labor unions and offering sort of their own bill that they thought would give the labor unions power and give, they said, workers some of the things that they needed. But in their bills, rather, they were limiting the regime of employee rights that gig workers got. Particularly, they were unwilling to pay hours-based wages. They did not want to pay for that first period of time in which workers are waiting for fares. They did not want to pay into unemployment insurance, and they didn't, in what is one of the most dangerous occupations in the United States, ride-hail driving, they did not want to provide workers' compensation. So I argue that regulators should instead consider extending the scope of employee rights as opposed to limiting it, extending it to include scheduling flexibility for platform workers. So something that the companies proposed in their last-ditch attempt in early September to create an AB5 carve-out for themselves was actually instructive on this point. So this is taken from their proposed legislation, which was leaked to the press, and they had excellent language to help regulators think about how to legally inscribe scheduling flexibility for workers. You see here, it says, driver does not prescribe specific hours during which a network driver must be logged on. So as we think about the future of app-based platform work, my research underscores two important lessons. One, despite what survey research seems to indicate, workers need and want the basic employment benefits that offline workers enjoy. And two, the nature of app-based work gives regulators the opportunity to grow instead of to limit these benefits, to account for the realities of both post-industrial service work and the complicated lives of today's workers. So now that the state is actively enforcing AB5 against Uber and Lyft, and we have a proposition on the ballot to undo all of the enforcement mechanisms, I'm actively encouraging regulators to think about their potential role in ensuring that workers are able to maintain scheduling flexibility, especially if the proposition fails. I'm also talking to legislators and advocates in a number of other states, including New York, Washington, and Illinois, where they're looking to inscribe an AB5-like law into their labor codes. And I contend that as we think about app-based service work and regulating the future of work more broadly, we must take seriously that many workers need control over when they work. And now that the companies have the technological capacity to meet those needs, we must hold them to it. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Veena Dubal. It's an amazing presentation and Uber Ambivalence about the contradictions involving our regulation and the perspective of workers. Well, I have two questions, and then people can ask and think to Veena Dubal. First question is about the open letter to Principles for Ethical Research in the Gig Economy. I'm a signatory to, and I would like to answer me. Why is it necessary, or why is it important, principles for ethical research on the gig economy in this context, in this scenario in which companies, platforms try to influence academic research with attacks, with bots, and whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm so glad you've asked it. So gig companies, as many of you know, especially the ones in the United States, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, these companies have never turned a profit. So the way that their business models work essentially is that they have, billions of dollars of venture capital funding that they use to lure drivers in, lure consumers in, and also to create, using all this funding to create a regulatory environment that is suitable to them. This is similar to what tobacco companies have long done in the United States, similar to what companies like FedEx have done in the United States. They have sponsored, meaning paid for, academic research that is intended to benefit them, and they use that research to shape the narrative for regulators. So in this paper, I referenced this paper by Jonathan Hall and Alan Krueger. Jonathan Hall is an Uber economist. He's in-house at Uber, and he has written any number of papers with economists outside of Uber, all of which have been heavily problematized by independent academics. But the problem is that this research exists. Academics who are not inside Uber, who have affiliated with Uber to do this, have legitimized the research by partnering with their in-house economists. And no matter how not independent it is, no matter that it was framed by the gig companies for the gig companies, it ends up influencing regulators. So For example, right now in California, we are at a juncture. In the next 2 months, California voters will vote on this proposition, Proposition 22, that ultimately would get rid of AB5-like regulations in the gig economy and create a third category of substandard worker protections for Uber and Lyft drivers. Although it sounds like there are a lot of good protections in the proposition, unsurprisingly, if you actually analyze it, there's very little that the law does except for inscribe precarity into law. And to get this law passed, Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi continues to cite to the study that was produced in conjunction with Uber that came out of Cornell University. And the study, which prompted this letter that Professor Groman is referencing, was conducted by academics outside of Uber, but all of the questions and assumptions that went into formulating the study ended up having an impact on the findings in the study, which basically they found that in Seattle, drivers had an average wage of $23, except for they didn't subtract any of the expenses that went into driving to get at this $23. And they didn't highlight the fact that many drivers, and even in their study, were making below the minimum wage. So the Uber CEO continues to sort of spew the statistic from the study. He claims it's the only good study that's been done. He uses it to dismiss all of the rest. Similarly, the study has found its way into the talking points of all of the PR flags for the companies, and it's having an influence on how regulators think about Uber work in California. So the letter that Professor Groman is referencing was written and signed by researchers who do gig economy research all over the world, who simply were making a commitment to doing research that was independent and that was not influenced by companies, that was not paid for by companies. And also, if you are claiming generalizability, to make the data public. So that's the other issue here, is that these companies, they create their own studies and then they say, we have the only answer because we're the only ones that have the data, but then they won't share the data, which goes against sort of the basic principles of economists and political scientists and sociologists. Sharing data, making sure that it's replicable is actually quite an important principle of independent research if you're talking again about generalizable data. And so, our hope with this letter was to really create peer pressure amongst the hundreds of academics and researchers all over the world who are studying this incredibly precarious work, to make sure that they did this work with ethical principles in mind, because all of these studies, while they might increase a particular researcher's profile, the researcher's institute might get money for the study and might seem prestigious, it impacts real people's lives. And as researchers, we should be committed at the very least to ensuring that our research does not hurt people. And that we are actually in search of the truth, and not the rosy tinted truth that the corporations would like for the public to see.
Thank you very much, Veena. It's very important to us researchers. The next question is from Anaís Bertoni, here from Unisinos University. She asks, how can legislation intervene in this type of paradox, ambivalence between users versus workers? What are the challenges of labor law in this context?
How can legislation interfere in the paradox between users versus workers? So I wonder if I could just ask for a little clarification. Do you mean how can legislation sort of help workers or help consumers be on the same side as workers, or what's the paradox between users and workers?
Yeah, the question is about the consumers versus workers, but I think you can answer by defending workers.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, interestingly, this is not necessarily just about legislation, but interestingly, in the gig economy, particularly, and we see this very clearly in the pandemic, consumers and workers have shared interests. So I always say, you know, you don't want someone driving your body around who hasn't slept for, you know, had a good night's sleep, who's been sleeping in their car, who's been working for 16 hours a day. You certainly don't want someone in America with Instacart. I don't know if you have this in Brazil, but here we have people who are collecting groceries and delivering them so that we don't have to, you know, middle class America doesn't have to go to the grocery store and expose ourselves to the coronavirus. And so we don't want these people who are, you know, picking up our food and handling our fruit. We don't want them also to be sick with the coronavirus. And so we want them to feel like if they're sick, they can stay at home and they should have paid sick leave. So right now, there's a lot of interesting cultural conversations being had about the importance and the alliances really between consumers and workers. While consumers do want cheap services, they also, I think, benefit from healthy workers who are earning a living wage. And so in California, we talk a lot about how this legislation, this AB5 legislation, which makes it very clear that workers are employees and get paid sick leave, get a wage floor, get overtime protections, get health insurance, that all of these things are really good, not just for the workers and their families, but actually good for the consumers who are using the services. And the company's argument is always that, oh, well, this is going to raise prices and no one's going to be able to use it. It's going to become inaccessible. And the truth of the matter is that there are many, many ways that the companies could reallocate assets such that it doesn't raise prices exorbitantly. Right now, the executives at these companies sometimes make 3 times more what an average executive in America made 20 years ago. And so there are ways to make it so that the expenses don't fall on the backs of consumers, and simultaneously that workers are living lives that are healthy and protected and secure.
Great, thank you very much, Veena. The next question from our friend Rodrigo Carelli from UFRJ, Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Rodrigo asks, the franchise strategy that Uber and Lyft are planning, the franchise strategy that Uber and Lyft are planning is something that's already been used similarly in Brazil by food delivery platforms. What do you think about this franchise strategy?
I would love to hear more about the food delivery platforms in Brazil and the franchise strategy, but I think that this is, just another attempt to take all of the risk and liabilities associated with business and put it on the backs of individual workers under the myth of being a small business person. So in California, I've written this paper from 2017 about this very same phenomenon that happened in FedEx. FedEx is a delivery service that is quite prominent in the US, one of 2 big delivery services, the other one being a unionized employee delivery service, UPS. And FedEx, when they lost misclassification litigation in 2014, instead of converting their drivers to workers, to employees, they created a franchise model, essentially, where every driver had to buy 5 trucks and buy 5 different routes and have employees themselves. And because there is not a lot of surplus value in delivery, ultimately the people at the bottom were squeezed the tightest. So some of the drivers for the middlemen, for now the franchisors, are on public benefits. No one has health insurance. They're not getting workers' comp. And I think the same is true for the ride-hailing industry. Demand is finite. And it changes depending on tourism, depending on global pandemic, depending on all kinds of things. And so in an environment where demand is so limited and also dynamic, I think that moving to a franchise model, just while ridding the companies of the potentially, actually not totally, but potentially ridding the companies of risks and liabilities, could also be even more devastating for workers at the bottom. It's just one more signal that these companies are really unwilling to to be socially responsible and do what's necessary to do well by both the workers who create the value for the company and the consumers who benefit from the business.
Great, thanks. The next question, it's mine. What do you think about movements like platform co-ops?
Yes, it's a really good question, and I've been writing a little bit about this. I think that a platform co-op, particularly in the ride-hail context, could work, but only under a highly regulated system in which supply is curtailed. So, for example, there have been some efforts at ride-hailing co-ops in cities when Uber and Lyft left. As a result of one of their capital strikes. So in Austin, there was a cooperative effort, and it was semi-successful. And I say semi because the cooperative itself ended up becoming incentivized to, they didn't want the city to regulate supply at all. Basically, they wanted the city to be able to put out as many vehicles as possible. But the problem with that is that, again, with limited demand, not everyone in the cooperative would be able to make enough money. So in the taxi industry, where we did have a cooperative in San Francisco for a long time, we had Green Cab, which was a cooperative, we had Yellow Cab, which was a cooperative. Even though the workers were not considered employees, they were able to get some semblance of a living wage, and there wasn't a lot of hierarchy between there wasn't any hierarchy between or among workers because it was a cooperative setting. But the reason that it worked was because the drivers were working in a system where supply and fare was regulated. So the city decided, well, we're only going to let 1,700 cabs out in San Francisco, the city and county of San Francisco at any given point. We're going to raise fares during this time period because demand is low and drivers need to make a living. So it really only worked when there was a central regulator that was calibrating it. And again, that's the case because this is an industry that has never worked without those kinds of regulations in place because demand is so limited.
Great, thanks. Next two questions from Gabriel Ferri, undergrad student from Unisinos. Professor Veena Dubal, if Uber, like companies, starts to treat drivers as employees, the barriers to enter the job as drivers wouldn't be much bigger. And the next question from Rodrigo Carelli too. What are the odds for the Uber Lyft ballot in California?
Great question. So for the first question about whether or not there would be higher barriers to entry, it would be not as easy for anyone who wanted to drive and make extra money to download an app and to do so. And that is because the companies would have to more tightly fit demand and supply. So they wouldn't be able to allow anyone to work on the platform, which is what Dara Khosrowshahi sort of underscores over and over again when he's arguing against employment status. What he doesn't say, however, is that when you turn on the Uber app and you download it on your phone and you start working, you are not necessarily earning any money. You cannot just turn on the app and earn. There has to be demand. And so the vast majority of the work on Uber and Lyft's platforms are actually conducted by full-time workers, not casual workers, not people who just want to make a few bucks on the side. And in fact, 70% of people who sign up to work on the Uber app quit within 6 months because they realize it's not remunerative. They don't enjoy driving around in circles trying to get a fare and then losing money on gas and insurance and vehicle expenses. So the idea that right now that anyone can earn and that employment status would increase barriers, I think is a misguided one because in fact, anyone, it is true, can download it and try and earn, but there are many barriers to earning because of the oversupply of drivers on the road, again, because of lack of regulation and self-regulation. With regard to the proposition, let me tell you about this proposition and then I'll tell you what I think the odds are. So Proposition 22 which the companies have spent $110 million instead of, just paying their workers. They've poured over $110 million into this proposition. They have hired political opposition researchers, some of whom have targeted me. They have hired PR companies. They have hired all kinds of, even to get signatures to get on the ballot, they paid $4 a signature. That is more money than some drivers make an hour working for the company. So they put this proposition on the ballot, and what it does is it pays drivers only during the time period when they've been assigned a worker, assigned a consumer, a rider, and when they're actually carrying the rider from point A to point B. During a pandemic, drivers right now are telling me that over 50% of the time that they're driving, there is no one in the car because no one is riding. In California, we have record numbers of people contracting and dying from the coronavirus. So drivers essentially right now would not be earning for over 50% of the time that they are actually working were this proposition to pass. So that's the main thing, that they want to make this piecework that is not paid by the hour. There's no overtime provisions, so drivers can continue to go back and forth between the two apps. They could work for 24 hours if they wanted to and not make any kind of overtime. In California, if you work more than 40 hours a week as an employee, you get 1.5 times your normal wage once you go over 40 hours. So that's not there. And then they don't give you health insurance. They give you some small percentage of drivers would get healthcare subsidies. They don't give you workers' compensation. So if you're injured on the job, that's on you. And they don't give you unemployment insurance, which we found during the context of the pandemic was, incredibly, incredibly important. So the other implication of Proposition 22 would be that it would be very hard for drivers to unionize ever. So under US federal labor law, you can only unionize if you are considered an employee. And there has been no definitive decision on Uber driver status under federal labor law. The Trump administration wrote an advisory letter, which has no precedential value, but just wrote an advisory letter saying, we think these drivers are employees. Under a Democrat administration, under the Biden administration, God willing, it would be very different. I think that these drivers would necessarily be found to be employees and have the right to collectively bargain, unless this proposition passes, because it essentially would cement certain things about their work that would make it much harder at a federal level for drivers to have employee status under the National Labor Relations Act. Now, what are the chances that this will pass? In California, it's become a partisan issue. So the Democratic Party has unanimously voted against or they are not endorsing Prop 22. Biden and Kamala Harris have both said that they are against Prop 22, and it is the California GOP, that is the Republicans that are supporting it. That said, the companies have tremendous power over voters, not just because their service is popular, but because they are continuing to use access to consumers through emails and text messages to tell them how to vote. And they are using the same misleading narrative that you heard in my paper that was used in the Alan Krueger and Jonathan Hall study, where they're saying drivers, if Proposition 22 does not pass, drivers are going to lose their independent contractor status, which they need. They're going to lose their flexibility. They're also using these studies that I try and debunk in this paper to say that drivers want to be independent contractors. And so they have a lot more power than most other companies do to sway the electorate's voting decisions. Right now, the way it's polling, it looks like something like 31% of people are ready to vote in favor of the law. And then many people are undecided, and I think 21% are voting, saying they're ready to vote against the law. So it's very much up in the air. And there's going to be a lot of political education work that needs to be done between now and November. But the difference is that the No on Prop 22 campaign, which is funded mainly by the Transportation Workers Union and the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, they've only put under $1 million into fighting the campaign. So the the campaign doesn't have money even for things like no on Prop 22 stickers or t-shirts. They've mostly been doing social media education and trying to win over people in the newspapers, et cetera. But the kind of political work that needs to be done right now, which is really knocking on people's doors and talking to them about the dangers of this proposition, can't be done because of the coronavirus. And so the fact that these companies have so much money to pay for advertisements, to pay for Facebook ads, to pay for TV ads, to pay for all kinds of things is really scary and might have an impact on the outcome.
Great. The last three questions in one answer. Vanessa Araújo from Brazil asks if the legal strategy for recognizing the classification of workers through judicial litigation has proved to be efficient for reformulating the business models of platforms. And Samuel Ortiz from Chile asks about based on experience, you believe that this legal discussion will be maintained or the companies will engage in fraud? And the last question from Ana Paula da Rosa, our head of department here. Do you think the new labor laws try to regulate without listening to the workers, to the people directly involved? And how can such regulations be gradually extended to other sectors, like education, like universities?
It's a great question. So I'll go down them very quickly. Is the legal strategy efficient in getting these companies to comply with basic worker protections laws? So far, no. So far, there's been no, we've seen no changes. So there has been, what will happen in the next few months, and the California bill will be quite telling, because right now what's going on is there was an injunction. The California court said to the companies that you absolutely must treat your workers like employees. This was 2 weeks ago. The companies appealed and they got a stay on the injunction until the proposition, essentially. So now they are waiting, the courts are waiting to see what happens with the proposition. If the proposition does not pass, the court has also asked the CEOs of the companies of Lyft and Uber to sign swear through declarations, through court declarations, that they have a plan in place to comply with employee status. And so, we will see over the next few months whether this is not just efficient, but actually whether it is effective. With regard to whether or not they will comply or whether they will engage in fraud, I think that there is so much scrutiny over these companies, especially these two companies right now. Frankly, I think that the next administration, whether or not we have a Biden administration, Democratic administration, or whether we continue with Donald Trump, will actually have a huge impact on what kinds of laws that they will be able to either get passed or create at state and federal level. I think if Biden wins, it will be much harder for them to continue to operate in this way. It'll be much harder for them to write laws that fit their business model. There have already been several attempts at the federal level and some successful attempts at state levels, particularly in the southern states in the United States. And I think that if we have a Biden administration, things will be different. There's a lot of scrutiny in this particular sector of the economy in the United States. And then how do we get labor laws that reflect worker needs and power and extend these to different parts of the economy, like the precarious work in academia. We have a lot of precarious work. Much of the teaching that is done in US universities, and maybe this is true in Brazil as well, is done by adjunct professors who sometimes make less than the minimum wage. I really see AB 5 as a push towards what David Whale against what David Whale calls the fissured workplace, which is exemplified also in the academy. It makes it much harder for companies or universities to shift risk and liabilities onto precarious workers. The problem, however, is not the law. I think it's the enforcement. So in many cases, we have laws on the books that make things like this illegal or make it or should make it illegal, but we don't have regulators or policymakers or state actors who are willing to enforce the law against those companies. And so I think it's not just a legal shift, but also a cultural and political shift that really needs to happen to make this kind of work unacceptable as a matter of course in all of our economies.
Great, Veena. Thank you very much one more time. And thank you to having us tonight with this fantastic presentation. And I hope we'll be meet in person next year. Maybe.
I would love that. I would love it. You invite me and I'm there.
Yeah.
It was such a pleasure. And the questions were so great and so thoughtful. And I look forward to many more conversations with those who asked questions and even those that are listening. And certainly with you, Rafael, thank you for the invitation. It was really an honor.
Yeah, and me and you will have in another project in Big Data and Society with Antonio.
I heard. I heard all about this. Yeah, I'm excited about it. Looking forward to it.
So small.
Yeah, it's true. It's a small group of us who care about these very important issues.
Yeah. Gente, muito obrigado pela participação. Hoje mais uma live de DigiLabour. O Rodrigo Carelli também está aqui mandando um abraço para a professora Veena Dubal. E fiquem bem. O nosso próximo encontro é na Maratona DigiLabour de Trabalho Digital, em setembro. Teremos Nils Van Dorn, Rodrigo Carelli, Renan Calil e outros pesquisadores de trabalho digital. Aguardamos vocês no mês de setembro. Um abraço e até lá.